tailor some recommendations and share that insight with families. So I am excited to get started today, and I'm going to take just a minute to share my screen. All right. Lisa, if you can nod, if everybody can see. Great. Okay, wonderful. This is a different format for me. I've done one other presentation via webinar since the COVID restrictions, and I find it to be a little bit challenging because I'm not used to just lecturing for a long period of time. I prefer when I'm speaking to take questions and engage with my listeners, and so this is a little bit different for me. I appreciate that many of you submitted questions ahead of time. And so to the best of my ability, I have tried to build in responses to that answer, or responses to those questions as we go through the seminar this evening. We did want to try to keep the focus of this particular session on special education during the pandemic. So some of the more general questions I have had to refocus about, how I would answer some of those questions in light of what we're currently experiencing. So I apologize if I don't get directly to your question. If you feel like you're still left with questions, feel free to submit it closer to the end of our first hour, and Lisa will monitor those so we can try to circle back and get all of your questions answered. So what do we know now? What are we still waiting to learn? And what can we do now to prepare for what the fall may look like? Those are some of the challenges that we're going to try to cover today. And let me see here. I can get this too. There we go. All right. So what do we know now? Not as much as we had hoped. I think that the one thing.
I have to interrupt you for a second. Yeah. I'm hearing that people can only see the speaker and can't see
the slides.
The slides. Okay, now I hear a lot of people saying they can see both. So I don't know if that. Okay, everyone seems to see now. All right.
Okay, good.
I'm just going to stay on then with mine on because it might have something to do with it.
That's great. So what do we know now? Not as much as we had hoped. I think that some of the things that we do know is that schools and kids are struggling with some of the virtual and distance learning that we've been trying to sort of patch together. And I really do give a lot of credit to our educators who came to this as unexpectedly as the families and the kids did. This has really been challenging. And unfortunately, there is no consistency from district to district or school to school. Every school district had to make decisions based on their internal resources, their familiarity with technology, their students' access to technology, the need to develop paper-based programming. And so, I think that right now what has been going on has been inconsistent from district to district. My guess is that if I polled two of you from two different districts, your experiences have been very different. We are starting to see some guidelines for the fall. Right now, those guidelines are still in draft form. They are not published or official. Some of the CDC guidelines have made their rounds. You may have seen some of them online in a partial format. We have not seen final guidance from the Ohio Department of Education. What I have seen, and I have seen a draft copy of guidance, is that many of the things incorporated are suggestions and not necessarily requirements. So we'll talk through what most of those suggestions are and how they appear to be playing out in other industries around us. And I think you'll start to see that we're going to probably have some consistencies in the guidelines that our schools are getting with the same kind of guidelines that we're seeing in our community-based settings, in retail, in gyms, in restaurants, and some of the other guidelines that we're seeing for some of those other community-based industries. Some of the guidance that we are also getting, and a lot of you had questions about extended school year. One of the pieces of information that the Ohio Department of Education has shared is that they want to treat extended school year and any compensatory services that may be needed because of COVID closures separately. I'll talk a little bit about that when we get further into the discussion today. I think that may be a little bit of a difference between a legal analysis and what is practical and may have been more effective. But we're sort of stuck with that guidance at this point. So we'll talk a little bit about that. One overarching question that we got many, many times, though, was whether or not the federal government or state government have issued waivers to any school districts about the necessity of providing a free, appropriate public education to a child with a disability. The answer to that question is no. No waivers have been granted, and we do not expect that waivers will be granted for the provision of FAPE to a student with a disability. So what that's going to mean is that the decisions that we make moving forward, particularly for the fall, are going to have to ensure that students are still receiving a free, appropriate public education, even under some of the restrictions that we've been experiencing. So we'll talk about what that's going to look like. There have been a couple of waivers in terms of timelines, particularly as they relate to evaluations, but at this point, that's really all that we're seeing. A couple of the things we know: this is fluid, unforeseen, and unprecedented. This is something that we've never had to deal with before in our lifetimes, at least. I think it's interesting that as we are starting to look at history and what happened during the flu epidemic in 1918, we are seeing some consistencies in some of the responses that we have today. But this is really unprecedented, and our use of technology to address these kinds of situations is unprecedented. We do not have a one-size-fits-all approach to special ed. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach to managing this impact on students. And of course, we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to providing services to students because none of our kids are the same. So I do think that it's going to be important as we move forward with this summer in preparing for the fall, and maybe even now while you're having some of your final extended school year conversations. I think it is going to be important to remind the teams that even though we have to make some policy-based decisions, that our kids are still unique individuals, and we have to be looking at individualized decisions based on student needs and the IEP. I talked at the beginning of this that services have been inconsistent. So one thing that I wanted to kind of share with you is what I'm seeing globally, because I think some of you may have experiences that are limited to the district that you're in, the services that your child may have been receiving, or what you're hearing locally. So what I have seen is a breadth of services from, you know, some kids are getting 100% of everything on their IEP in a one-on-one video fashion, and some students are getting basically a check-in opportunity with the teacher if they have questions about homework that's being assigned in the gen ed setting. Some students haven't gotten any of their related services, some have gotten all of them, and there's just a wide discrepancy from district to district and building to building about what students have been getting. When we had to do this initially back in March, each district had to create its own plan. There were no required level of services. There is no magic ratio that school districts were told to provide in terms of, you know, if the IEP said 1 hour, how much do we have to provide? There is still no specific guidance about that. Basically, what schools were told to do was to do their best, do something. And then after the fact, we'll figure out how to make up services when we figure out what we're going to do next. I think that we were kind of all comfortable with that in the emergency of what happened in March. I think we started to become less comfortable with that as April and May have now rolled on and we've gotten to the end of the school year. My guess is that there has been a lot of patience. I've seen parents with a lot of patience and understanding. I've seen teachers really doing their best to try to make this work. But at some point, we have to figure out what it means to fix what has occurred over this past period of time where students maybe didn't get the services that they needed. So that's how I'm going to close the conversation. What types of things we should be thinking about now to start to remedy some of the inconsistencies in the provision of services that we've seen. What are some virtual best practices? We had a lot of questions about what have I seen that have been working or what's working well for students. Some things that I've seen that have gone on that have been positive. And the reason that I want to cover this is because there may be times moving forward that we're looking at virtual schooling as either all or part of a person's educational program. And so knowing what some best practices are and what some schools are doing very well, I think can help inform IEP teams about ways that we can really make this work. The provision of direct instruction, I think, is critical. One distinction I want to make is direct instruction targeted to IEP goals versus direct instruction targeted toward subject matter. I have seen, again, inconsistencies there where students have been scheduled to receive their classes with the support perhaps of an intervention specialist, but they haven't necessarily received the direct instruction on the specific goals and objectives. So I think we need to be careful when we're having conversations with our IEP teams that we're really parsing that piece of it out. I have seen successful instruction happening in group settings and one-on-one settings. That's really going to be dependent on the student and the teacher and the content. We have seen teachers using recorded lectures so students can access that information later if they weren't able to join at a particular time, a Zoom session or a live session. They're able to record and then view some direct instruction, work on their individual tasks, and then turn that in. I have seen continued therapy services, sometimes with the assistance from a parent or caretaker for some of the hands-on therapies that have been needed, or some of the more hands-on or physical prompting or gestural prompting that may be needed. We've seen parent training from those therapists to enable that to occur. And so there are some really nice things happening that I think we can use to inform our best practices as we look at continuing some virtual programming for students in the fall. Data collection from a virtual best practice perspective has also been challenging. I love that parents are helping their kids in completing a lot of their work, but it's now become a little bit challenging for our teachers to know what is a paragraph that mom's edited versus a paragraph that the child turned in independently. And so we're encouraging parents to collect data on how much assistance they provided so that that information can be shared with the teachers. Teachers are scheduling specific instructional sessions for data collection, which I think is a great idea. That can really help to target some goals that may be a little more challenging, like social skills, behavior, classroom attending, some of those softer skills that are more challenging to provide virtually. And I have also seen teachers creating very specialized worksheets targeted to specific goals and objectives for students to work on to collect that specific data. So I've been excited to see some of those really positive things. Finally, and I'm putting this at the bottom of the screen because this is a very, very new and emerging support service. Some districts, and I want to say this very carefully because schools are closed by order of the governor, and they are not allowed to be providing in-person services unless they get a very specific waiver from their Department of Health. So please don't think that this is something that's happening a lot. This has only occurred in very isolated situations thus far, but I think can be an interesting approach for some of our kids that are struggling the most with online instruction. And that's allowing paraprofessionals or aides to actually go into the home to provide the support service needed for the child to access the education. Again, that's a very new and very emerging service, and not one that schools are currently allowed to provide unless they get a waiver from their departments of health. And those waivers are not happening generously. So I just want to caution everybody that while this may sound like a great idea, you're probably not going to be able to run out and get it today. So I just want to be cautious in making some of these suggestions and letting you know this is happening out there, but it may not be happening as frequently or as much as we think it may be needed moving forward. I'm checking my notes as we go here just so that I'm sure I'm answering questions. I apologize. A couple of other things that I wanted to talk about while I'm on this slide. Tech support. One thing that we're seeing that may be needed for virtual best practices is technology training for some of our students. Although they may do well with an iPad, they may not understand how to navigate some of the software that they're being asked to use. So there needs to be some very special training that's scheduled to teach them how to use the technology and to use it independently. The creation of checklists can be very helpful. If the child is able to follow a visual checklist, certainly that is a wonderful support mechanism. I would encourage you, if you're finding that you're having to walk your child through that step over and over again, that you can create that checklist yourself. But as we start talking to our IEP teams about what may be needed moving forward, I would put that into your mind if you're struggling with the virtual online schooling. And then the last piece that I wanted to talk about is online schooling for preschool students. I had a very specific question about this, and it is something that I have struggled with one of my clients. Our preschool kids who are receiving services are probably some of the more challenging students that we're having to service. Their attending to a screen is not very good. We often can deliver services to them only in short increments, which makes scheduling very challenging from the school perspective. One thing I would encourage you to do is to try to schedule shorter video sessions that are direct with the teacher, direct interaction, as opposed to kind of recorded lessons. If there is a way to incorporate play-based activities and you have someone within the home that can facilitate that play-based activity, whether it's a parent, another sibling, a grandparent, an aide or a babysitter that you have coming in, asking for those play-based ideas can be very helpful. But I think it's some of our preschool kids are going to be some of those kids that we're going to be looking at having to provide some compensatory services to. So this is kind of the looking back and what we're seeing part of the conversation. I think that a lot of families are now at the point where they're having extended school year conversations with the district. And as we see things reopen, some of the questions that we're asking districts is it now time for us to talk about resuming services? And because we haven't had services for so long, we're concerned. We're seeing regression from March. We're seeing difficulty in social settings. We're seeing some changes in behavior. And I think that what is challenging is that right now the guidance that ODE and the federal government have provided to schools, they're telling schools to treat ESY and compensatory services for COVID-related issues separately. And that the ESY analysis should be done as a pure extended school year analysis. And the COVID-related issues should be addressed when students return to instruction and we can assess what they've lost. I think that while that legal guidance makes sense from a legal perspective, it really does not make sense from a practical perspective, where, you know, what are we going to call the regression, whether it's COVID related or ESY is defective or online isn't effective. We're going to end up in the same place in the fall with a child who may have lost more skills than needed because of this gap in instruction, whether the gap in instruction took place March until now or now until August. You know, the pure ESY analysis is primarily a regression recoupment analysis. During extended breaks without services, can we anticipate, or do we have data to support that a child will regress in the skills identified on the IEP, such that when instruction resumes in the fall, they will not recoup those skills within an adequate amount of time? And I wish I could tell you what that adequate amount of time was, because it's going to vary by student. An ESY analysis is very difficult. Some other eligibility factors for ESY include eligibility for skills that are emerging. And so we look at whether or not there are some emerging skills that the child will lose if they are not addressed for an extended period of time. And there are a couple of other minor eligibility factors, but both the Ohio Department of Education and federal guidance primarily rely on that regression recoupment standard to provide extended school year summer services to students. So one concern that we have with extended school year is that almost every school district is still having to provide extended school year services virtually because they have not been given permission or guidelines to reopen. And so without very specific guidelines to reopen or permission to do so, they're having a very difficult time trying to even envision what ESY could look like in person. Most of the ESY that's happening this summer is happening virtually. If student isn't benefiting from virtual instruction, what's the purpose? And we are trying to work through with districts a couple of different options. One, we have asked districts to go back to their Department of Health and see if it's possible to get permission to provide ESY services for a specific student in person. Some districts have already tried to do that and have been denied by their departments of health. We have also looked at parents providing reimbursement for services that they can get from private providers who are reopening. So there are a couple of camps that are reopening. There are some therapy centers that are reopening to provide some services. There are private tutors that are willing to provide services. And so parents are taking those options back to their school district and saying, listen, I get that maybe you can't provide the service, but I have found somebody who can. I really think we need to do it in person. Will you consider reimbursing us or contracting with that private provider to provide the services? We're seeing some success with that in some school districts. In others, we're not. They're still providing virtual services. And virtual services are working for some kids. So I don't want to make it sound like virtual services are just not worthy, because they really are working well for some students. So I just want to keep in mind, again, these are individual decisions. We have to consider what the need of the specific child is and look at everything from that perspective. I know that some families are concerned that in the past they've had extended school year services that are more lengthy than what camps are providing this summer or what they're going to be able to access this summer. We have had some ESY awards from school districts that we can't fulfill because there are no private programs who are going to be operating for that long. What I would encourage families to do is to just document that the original decision was that ESY serving with what was available, and then look at whether or not you can supplement your camp experience or those closure dates with tutoring, social skills groups, or some other form of support. Also, to document if you're offered services, but those services are virtual, and you're concerned that your child cannot benefit from virtual services, that you are not rejecting ESY services, but that you're rejecting virtual services, even though you believe ESY may still be necessary. And that's really just to document this entire decision-making process so that next summer, if you're having ESY conversations, they don't look at what was done this summer as representative of what a child may or may not need. So I wanted to address a couple of those things because those were specific questions that families had. And it's frustrating. I get it. I think it's very frustrating for families who see this opportunity looming over the next couple of months where we maybe could shore up some of the concerns that we have about lack of instruction for the last couple of months. There are a couple of reasons that that's difficult. I think it's difficult because we don't have a lot of assessments to show what might be necessary. And it's difficult because we may not be able to provide the services that students need even this summer because of some of the restrictions of schools opening or servicing students in person. So unfortunately, we're not able to take advantage of this time frame, I think, as much as we would like to. So the big question, and this was the primary question that I had with what was submitted, is so are kids going to go back to school in the fall? I do think so. I do think kids are going to go back to school in the fall, but that right now is looking like it's going to be subject to many different limitations. And again, at the beginning of this, you'll remember that what I said was that right now those guidelines are not final, published, or required. They're simply suggestions. And we are struggling to know which of those suggestions are going to be implemented by which district. What we do know is that each district is going to be creating its own plan based on guidance from their county health department, the Ohio Department of Education, the Ohio Department of Health, the governor's office. And so I anticipate that that guidance is going to change as we continue to learn more about the transmission of COVID-19, as we see how COVID-19 transmission either increases or decreases based on the summer, based on social distancing. I can tell you that right now, having looked at the guidance and the draft form, current ideas include those kinds of things that we've been hearing for other community businesses. Things like, we can open, but districts are going to have to maintain social distancing in classrooms, buses, playgrounds, gyms, lunchrooms, hallways, offices, nursing stations. And so you start to see kind of this mounting difficulty in envisioning how we maintain social distancing for crowded classrooms. That's where you're starting to hear that, well, maybe there's going to be this hybrid between online and in school, where some kids will come to school on some days and some kids will come on other days. And that is really because our classrooms are too small to enable social distancing to occur with the numbers of students that we have in them. We're seeing suggestions that playgrounds be closed, gymnasiums be closed or only open to a small number of students at a time, that students eat lunch in their classrooms to try to avoid crowded cafeterias, that they change classes in the hallways at staggered times, or that teachers change classrooms and not students. So there are a lot of very interesting ideas. I think that we are all worried about what those ideas are going to mean for our kids. When I say we're worried, I think we're worried across the spectrum, because I think some families feel very strongly that this social distancing has to be maintained in order for there to be an opportunity for a safe return to school. I think some families feel like their child's medical needs are probably going to prevent them from being able to go to school at all. in light of the susceptibility of their child or a family member to infection from COVID-19. And then we have concerns about some families feeling like these restrictions are too imposing on the ability of schools to provide educational opportunities for kids, and that kids need to be back in school full time, and that we will have to deal with infections as they may occur. So we have families who are across the spectrum in terms of what their personal political beliefs are, what their child's medical needs are, and we're not going to be able to make decisions based on those individual concerns. I do believe that we're going to see that most of this decision making is going to come through the governor's office and the Department of Health. Wearing masks is a big concern. I know it's a big concern for the population of students with autism. Right now, it does appear that there will be a requirement for students to wear masks to the extent possible. We are seeing absolutely exceptions to that rule for students that cannot tolerate wearing a mask all day, for students that are having difficulty either tactily or from a sensory perspective, kids that may have difficulty with that because of breathing limitations or restrictions. I would encourage you, if you haven't yet started, you may want to consider doing some mask training, or consider a hat that has a plastic shield on them. You can find them at Walmart. But they're like a fisherman's cap or a baseball cap that has just a clear plastic shield that comes down a little bit away from the face. I'm hoping that that's what most of our teachers are able to use. I don't have COVID, I promise. I'm hoping that that's what most teachers are able to use when they go back to school, so that their students can still see their faces, and we can still have some of those nonverbal cues that we use so often in teaching and trying to understand who's attending and paying attention, and who's with us. And I think that would be really helpful. I do expect that if any of that occurs so that we are part-time, that there will be supplemental virtual ongoing instruction along with the part-time school. One of the questions asked was, if the general ed students are going back part-time, is there maybe a possibility that some of our kids who have more significant needs would still attend full-time? I think that's absolutely a conversation for your IEP team to consider. And one thing I think that we all need to think about is that for people with disabilities, there may be the opportunity to request an accommodation to a policy or procedure that negatively impacts a person with a disability more than a person without a disability. So if you see a need for a modification to a policy or practice because of your child's disability, like they really need to be in school 5 days a week because of their educational or instructional needs, I think that's a conversation for your IEP team. I would anticipate that there may be students that would be an appropriate IEP team decision. I also think that there's a question about visitors for the fall. Right now, the guidance indicates that there will be no visitors permitted on campus while students are present. So I think for visitors, what that means for us as parents, or for IEP meeting attendees, is those are probably still going to occur via Zoom conference. Those are unlikely to occur in person. We aren't going to be seeing things like assemblies. I believe that anyone with an educational need to attend is not going to be considered a visitor. So I know we have a lot of our service providers that rotate buildings, that may service on a part-time basis students in one building or another building, or even across districts. Those people are going to be educationally necessary. I do not believe they're going to be considered visitors. So I anticipate that all of those individuals will be allowed to enter campus, but I don't foresee there being opportunities for observations in the classroom, some of those other limitations for visitors. So now that we know that we don't know what's going to happen in the fall yet, we're starting to see some guidance. When do we anticipate that some of these plans are going to be ready? I can tell you that your boards of education, your superintendents, your principals have been working on this already. Unfortunately, they're not just allowed to come up with a plan and open their doors. These plans have to all be approved by the County Department of Health. They have to be done in conjunction with a lot of stakeholders. We're talking about interacting with teachers' unions to try to figure out what does this look like for teachers. We have a lot of teachers who are concerned about coming back. We have some teachers who are ready to come back full force. We have some questions about what this means from a planning perspective for staff in terms of how do we plan to have students in seats every day while also servicing students who may be online. So these are detailed plans that have a lot of questions. I anticipate mid-July for general education plans, and then I anticipate, and maybe I'm wrong, but I anticipate there being a scramble between mid-July and mid-August to try to figure out how that's then going to apply to each of our kids with disabilities. Again, IEPs are individualized, and so I think we're going to have some question about how that's going to work. I am encouraging parents, and so you'll see these two bullet points, big bullet points here on this slide. I'm encouraging parents to meet individually with their IEP teams to discuss some of these bulleted issues. What changes are we going to need to make to the goals and services in the IEP based on schedule? What goals can be done virtually versus what goals do we focus on while in school? So maybe while the student is in school, we're not focusing on attending a science class. We can maybe do that more appropriately via virtual learning. Maybe we should be thinking about addressing social skills, behavior, classroom attending, and really honing in on goals and objectives. And I think, again, those have to be individually determined for each student. What tech supports may need to be added to the IEP, what training. Does the student need accommodations, again, to general policies so that they can benefit from their education? IEP teams may also need to meet to consider how closures have impacted the student. There is a broadening concern that students may be experiencing some additional anxiety or behaviors that they were not necessarily experiencing when they left school. I do anticipate that there are going to be some students who are going to experience some difficulty returning to school, and the teams need to anticipate the need for some of those transition back to school services to address some of those initial behaviors or anxiety. And I think we need to be able to get that on the table before the school year starts. It can be very difficult to schedule an IEP meeting over the summer. It can be easier if, when you request the IEP meeting from the Director of Special Education, that you suggest that you're willing to have a meeting without the full staff present to start to have some initial conversations. So you are permitted to convene a team with less than the required number of people if both parties agree to waive their participation. So those are just some thoughts about when we should start thinking plans might be ready, and then maybe when we should start thinking about meeting with IEP teams. I also think that teams are going to have to start to consider that big question. We did this in the spring quickly because we had to. We didn't have answers to these questions. We didn't really know what it was going to look like to try to figure out where our kids are now. But at some point, we're going to have to make some decisions about what, if any, compensatory services may be needed. I don't want to say that all kids are going to need compensatory services because they've been out of school since March. I anticipate that many will, but I have some clients that are doing very, very well in home instruction and in virtual education. They haven't lost a beat. And for those students, I'm not really concerned about trying to put together some compensatory program. We anticipate that all students are going to have experienced some impact to their educational trajectory because of this virtual period of time. Where we are concerned, though, about the need to request compensatory services for this period of time is when we've had a student who has experienced regression in their skills, and if so, how much, or a student who has experienced a lack of anticipated progress, so that this period of time has lasted and they needed to make progress on their goals and objectives in order to master them by the time the IEP is finished. If we've experienced a lack of anticipated progress during this time, what has that lack of anticipated progress been? How do we quantify it? And then what do we need to do to make up for that? It isn't, during this period of time, my child was supposed to get 1 hour a day of intervention, and they got 30 minutes a day of intervention, and so now you're going to owe me 30 minutes a day every day. It is not going to be that kind of minute for minute analysis. It's going to be more global than that, and we're going to really have to look at assessments and evaluations to determine regression, lack of anticipated progress, identify specifically where those are, and then figure out what we do. So we're going to have a period of assessment and evaluation, not necessarily a full-blown ETR or evaluation team report, but more of a focused intervention based on the goals and objectives. Really a focused targeting of data collection to see where we may have experienced smaller pieces, hopefully smaller pieces of regression or lack of anticipated progress. So how do we plan to get that information? When should we start to collect that information? I am advising most of my clients that we should plan to collect that information, not the first day back at school. I think kids are going to have some other things to worry about, but probably by the end of August, beginning of September, we should be doing some of that data collection. How is that going to look? Is that going to be done in person? Again, that's going to have to be an individual decision for every student. And then once we have this information, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to create a plan to compensate for this period of time? And there are several things that you can consider. You can consider looking at intensifying existing instruction. So we can add time, reduce the number of students in a group. We can more individualize or create a more highly structured curriculum to address it. We can consider adding instruction outside of the typical school day to address that need. So maybe we do some additional tutoring to support getting that child back up to where they would have otherwise have been. So that's what we think the analysis for compensatory service is going to look like for the period of time from March until now. How do we make up for what our kids may have missed? But I do want to kind of reiterate that I don't anticipate that students are going to need wholesale rewrites to their programs. I'm hoping that that's not the case. I'm hoping that districts provided enough support to enable students to kind of come back maybe only a little behind. For those of you who have been really unable to access virtual instruction, you're probably looking at a wholesale IEP rewrite to try to address some of these issues. Some special considerations. Again, I had indicated that there have been some timelines waived for evaluations, primarily for new evaluations. So where you have a child who is preschool age or transitioning from preschool to school age, or a student who is in the process of being newly identified, those evaluations have been on hold. Those are going to have to restart. There has been some testing that has been approved to be done online. So if you are one of those parents who are in this kind of testing period, I would circle back to your school district and the school psychologist now or within the next couple of weeks to request a meeting or a touch base just to see where they are, whether there's some things that they can start doing. And if not, really try to get a plan for that together. For reevaluations, the triennial reevaluations, most of those have occurred via record review. A lot of districts are just reviewing the records and the data that they have to certify ongoing eligibility, and then looking at doing a further evaluation at a later date. So you do not have to wait 3 years to do an evaluation, particularly if you've just done a record review. So I think what you might want to do the assessments that you need to do to complete the record review or to determine whether or not any compensatory service may be needed. Close the book on that ETR, give everybody some breathing room, and then as we see the next year unfold, there may be an opportunity to do a more complete reevaluation. Transportation. Transportation is going to be interesting, particularly trying to maintain social distancing. My guess is that the schools are going to be looking for volunteers, for parents to bring students. They're going to be looking for as many parents to kind of help as possible. There may be 2 or 3 busing cycles a day. We're not really sure what transportation is going to look like. For students on IEPs, transportation can be a required related service. If your child cannot access their educational services as outlined on the IEP without transportation, then that would be required. And that's for students who are enrolled in district programming, not necessarily students who are on a scholarship. When I say district programming, I mean that the placement on the IEP, the child needs to be transported to. So if your district has made a placement at a year-round autism school, then transportation to that placement would be a part of your IEP. If your child is attending another program based on parent choice, the transportation rules become much more convoluted. It largely depends on how far away the parent choice is from the school district of attendance, and there are just some complex transportation rules that don't apply today. I would be happy to answer that question, though, if you want to email me, and my email address is on the first slide, which I will share with you again at the end of the presentation. I think we also need to look at student health and family wellness. I had so many questions about what if the school's open but my child can't attend, or I'm worried, I'm scared. What if other family members are susceptible to infection and we just cannot risk anybody being exposed to COVID-19? I think that because every school district is kind of trying to figure out its own plan, what's going to probably end up happening with this is that we're going to have to wait and see come July what your district's plan is. I know that some families are starting to get emails from their school districts asking if they want to volunteer to be a virtual student next year. Some districts are still not in process of putting a virtual plan together. And so, it's very hard for me to answer this question. I do think, though, that what you need to do is to wait and see what the general rule is going to be. If the general rule for your district is that parents can elect in school or at home, then certainly if you're concerned about the health or welfare of your child, you can elect whichever of those opportunities you want to take advantage of. If your district has a general rule that all students will attend school or attend school on a part-time or swing basis, and you are concerned that your child cannot attend school for health-related reasons, I think you're going to probably need to get documentation of those health-related reasons from a physician, and then work with your IEP team to figure out how FAPE can still be provided for your child with those restrictions. That may look like a tutor coming to the house for a period of time. That may look like a combination of virtual and tutor. Again, a lot of that is going to depend on what your level of comfort or your child's medical status is in determining who can come in and out of the house. So those are going to have to be very, very individualized decisions. I will say, though, that fear, if the general rule for your school district is going to be kids are coming to school, fear is probably not going to be enough to keep your child home. You're going to have some medical documentation to support that decision. Certainly, parents always have the option to homeschool their child. That's an option that anybody can take. Students with disabilities have an option to take a scholarship program and use the scholarship to provide services. And there are creative ways of doing that with in conjunction with homeschooling. So if you're truly worried, you may want to start to investigate what that might look like for you. And again, I think that's going to be a very individualized process. Some concerns with related services. I think special considerations for IEP teams are going to have to include a focus on the provision of hands-on therapy programs like OT, PT, orientation and mobility services. So those hands-on therapies, I think we're going to have some conversation about how that's going to work, particularly if students end up doing more virtual programming next year. I think, again, our focus should be on what is needed for a free, appropriate public education, and how do we make this work. There are no special answers. I wish that I could tell you that I had come up with a solution to the, how to provide these services in a way that will keep everybody as healthy as possible. I think that all of the considerations that we're going through are options that people are trying to consider across the world. I think we're all worried about what that's going to look like for school next year. I think none of us really know how it's going to play out, and we're worried about what that's going to look like for our students. But I don't think that we can necessarily predict one way or the other, and we're just going to have to keep working through it. And again, I don't know that there's a magical answer to that question. So final slides, there were just some additional questions that didn't really fit in as I was going through. What are some creative ways to service challenging goals virtually? Some of these I'm going to save because we're running a little bit out of time, but some ways that I have seen people servicing some of these goals in executive functioning. We have seen a check-in at the beginning of the day with an intervention specialist, going through the outstanding assignments, planning the day, breaking that down into a visual checklist, and then another touch point later in the day to ensure that assignments are turned in, things are crossed off, and that they're putting together kind of this virtual support to manage executive functioning. For social skills, we're seeing a lot of online groups. That can be challenging, trying to get students to focus on the content as opposed to the social interaction. But for social groups, that actually works out pretty well. Coping skills and classroom behavior, those can be more challenging in an online or virtual setting. We have had some teachers ask parents to collect some data for them on some of those skills. We've had teachers sort of create sabotaged situations where students are going to have to ask for help. And so I think there's a balance that we're going to have to create. I'm hoping that our kids can be in school long enough that some of these more challenging goals to implement virtually can be the ones that we focus on in a school setting. How can we tell if virtual learning is working? There's only one answer to that question, and it's data. And I cannot stress enough that data has to be authentic, it has to be collected contemporaneously, and it needs to be shared. So parents, schools need to be sharing that information, particularly when parents are very involved in helping to facilitate the virtual learning. Some resources for parents to support learning over the summer. My guess is that you guys have more resources than I could ever tell you. Some things to consider: commercial workbooks. I think we're starting to see some of those get back in stock now. Back in March, it was really hard to get your hands on it. But don't be afraid to pick up a a workbook maybe a year under or the year that your child left. So if your child was in 4th grade last year, pick up a 4th grade math workbook and just kind of work with them on some of the worksheets over the summer. There's a lot of online tutoring, a lot of websites that are available. Khan Academy can be fun to do some virtual lessons, some online games. There are math games, typing games, reading games. Practice skills at home, play games together, go for walks together, talk. Talk. And I know that you guys probably do that naturally all the time. Make up games if you have to. When my nephew was struggling with math, we used to make up a game in the car where we would talk about what he had to go buy at the store and how much it cost, and we would just kind of make up a game, and I would give him ice cream or some little thing at the grocery store. Just keep him working at it. Zoom social events. So if you're still not able to get together, and most of us are not getting together with other people, Zoom social events, get your family together virtually. There are free Zoom subscriptions that you can sign up for, and you can share that with your friends. Private schools and students on scholarships. All schools are subject to closure rules, whether they're private or public. So even private schools are subject to closure rules when the state closes. Those are some special considerations, and I think I'd like more targeted questions on that. If you have more targeted questions, we can address some of those when we meet again in July. How can we express our concerns to Governor DeWine or the Ohio Department of Education? You can email them. That's the only avenue that I have found so far, and I'm having a difficult time getting through on email or in phone calls. There is not an organized task force at this point, I believe, that includes parents. And so I'm a little concerned that there is, the Ohio Department of Education is creating a lot of guidelines without considering the input from parents. I think the Ohio Coalition for the Education of Children with Disabilities is probably the entity closest enough representing parents and their voices to the Ohio Department of Education. So I think that from that perspective, communicating with the coalition, Disability Rights Ohio is another organization that has a strong viewpoint and ability to advocate for parents and families of students with disabilities. So sharing some of your concerns with them may be helpful. But that's a tough question. It was a good one though. I know that we've had other questions come in. I've been talking straight for an hour. I hope that I answered a lot of your questions, but I am going to ask Lisa to open up her microphone, and I am going to go back in the screen sharing to the cover page. And I don't know if you guys, for some reason, this font isn't showing up very well. I'm going to try to. Oh.
Hi there.
Hi.
I can put an email too that I send afterwards, if that's okay.
Okay.
So
yeah, that's fine. I'll email you the presentation.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you. That was awesome. I know that's a lot of stuff, a lot of unknowns. And like Kerry mentioned too, we are going to be doing this in 3 parts. So we're going to meet back again on July 9th for part number 2. So hopefully we'll have some more rolling guidelines coming out. And then we're going to meet again on August 6th so that we can give some more guidance on what we're seeing. We did have 2 questions that I don't know that we really covered. One was a family who has more than one student on an IEP. Any advice that you can give to those parents?
Yeah, you know, I'm sorry, I lost the, there it is. I lost the video feed for a minute. A family that has more than one student on an IEP, bless you. This is hard enough in the best of times with one student, let alone in some of these more challenging times with multiple students. What I would encourage you to do is to prioritize your concerns among the children. You're probably not going to make in the fall a perfect decision for each of the students in one meeting. I think that if you can prioritize your concern, the top 2 or 3 for each of your students, and really hone in and focus on those issues, you'll feel like you've accomplished enough to maintain each of them, while you're able to continue to work through some of the other issues throughout the year. I know, because I can see the list of participants, and I know some of the individuals who are here, that you're not alone, and that there are parents who are struggling to try to maintain educational programming for multiple kids. I wish I had more advice than to prioritize, but at this point, I think all families are probably going to have to prioritize the greatest need and what they really want the team to hone in on and focus on in the fall, particularly if we're looking at kind of a hybrid. As you're able to resolve the big ticket items, right, those big priority items, you can start to kind of work down your list and incorporate more nuanced services or programming, but it's going to be challenging. I would also ask the district, if there's going to be part-time scheduling, that either your children are scheduled together or separately based on your needs as a family. So I think that if it's easier for you to work with one child while the other one is at school, you may want to have them scheduled at opposite times to be there. If it's easier for you because you've got to work or because of whatever reason, that they go and are scheduled to be gone at the same time, that you make that request and that you work with your school to try to understand some of the limitations and difficulties that you're working with as a family.
I like that. Kerry, I know earlier when you and I were talking, we talked a little bit about documentation. What would you encourage families to be documenting during this process, for
So
a later date?
So a couple of things. Number one, I would document the services that they're getting. So what did their services look like from March until now? Did you keep a log, or is there a way for you to kind of summarize what occurred so that you know how much intervention did they really have? I would also encourage you to document or keep a log of your concerns. So because you're just now kind of exiting this mind space where you've been enmeshed in the math, the reading, the social skills, the speech services, and you've been there, you've seen it, write it down today, because as fresh as it feels today, in August, it's going to be a mile away from your memory. So write down your thoughts. Take a minute, grab a spiral notebook, and just write down math. What did you observe? Did you observe that the child was readily able to do the calculations but struggled with understanding the sequence in a story problem? Those nuanced observations can be so helpful to an IEP team, as opposed to a statement, boy, did they struggle in math. Can you understand the distinction there? So I would sit down and I would look at all of the goals and objectives on the IEP and just make yourself a note. What worked well, what didn't? What did you see your child excel at virtually? What did they not excel at? What was the struggle in trying to get them to attend? If virtual wasn't working, why not? Was it because they didn't know how to manage the platform? Was it because they didn't know how to manage the assignments? Was it because they were distracted looking at all the other kids and making faces? And was it really that the limit of instruction should have been 15 minutes and they were trying to do a full hour? The more information that you've got that's specific, the more you know how to work with the team to tailor the IEP in the fall. So I would encourage you now while it's still fresh, because a lot of schools closed last Friday and some are closing in the next week. Write it down while it's still fresh, so that you don't forget some of those thoughts by August. I would also encourage families to reach out sooner rather than later, to either your IEP coordinator, your special ed coordinator, your district director of student services, and let them know that you want an IEP team meeting sooner rather than later. Particularly if you're concerned about ongoing virtual learning, your child's attendance at school, a part-time school attendance based on your child's needs. I would encourage you to reach out soon and let the director know that you have these concerns, that you want to make sure that they're addressed before school starts, that you understand that they're in the process of putting together their master plan, but that you would like to know that you're on their radar screen for a meeting once the master plan is created to figure out what that looks like for your student.
Good information. The only other question that I saw that we didn't get answered was, who determines grades as far as being pass-fail versus a letter grade?
Who determines grades? Your school districts and your teachers.
Is it
So
done district-wide, or can there be an exception for an individual student?
So your district is going to have a district-wide policy, but like all policies for persons with disabilities, the IEP team can make a decision that that policy, when applied to a person with a disability, is not appropriate, accurate, fair, capturing their needs. And so I think you can consider that the IEP team look at the circumstances in assigning a grade. I can also tell you though, and this is not popular, grades really don't matter unless you're a high school student. So unless you're in high school and it's going on a high school transcript, the grade on one quarter or one semester, even a final grade for a student who's younger than high school and needing to earn credits for graduation, it has absolutely no bearing on anything moving forward. So grades really aren't the end all be all that we like to think they are, unless it's going on a high school transcript.
Well, that's good. The person who asked that question actually has a high school student, so that's where that concern is coming from.
And that's where it matters. And so I can understand why you would want to really look at that grade. A lot of schools are willing to look at a pass-fail right now. Many schools have transitioned to pass-fail grades for the fourth quarter. And again, I don't know what your district's particular rule is, but they're going to have a general rule that, again, you can request your IEP team to consider something different.
Perfect. All right. Well, I think that's all I see. So here comes another question, though, about grades. Are grades for special needs students applicable to college?
I'm not necessarily clear about what the question is. For all high school students, including students with disabilities, grades will appear on a transcript for high school. Colleges will consider high school transcripts and grades in their admissions decisions. I often encourage students with disabilities to use their high school application essay to describe their personal journey in learning to be a learner with their disability. Some students are really comfortable with that. Some don't like to self-disclose, and that is perfectly appropriate as well. I think, though, where you've got a couple of grades that you may want to explain, that's a really great opportunity to say, this is, this coursework reflected difficulty that I have with communication or language. And I have learned since then to better support my language deficits with more targeted vocabulary instruction, or, there's an opportunity to use that essay to really describe and to create insight into why some of those grades are what they are. But yeah, they'll be considered just like grades are considered for any college admission decision.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you, Kerry. This has been wonderful. I am looking forward to when we meet again, and we'll continue to try to navigate this. And again, anybody who is on who has some challenges that you're facing that you think we could assist with, reach out to our helpline, reach out to me. Give me some ideas for more webinars that we can do to help you. Whatever we can try to do, we're here for you. So we want you to know you're not alone, and please reach out. So
Lisa, I will email you the PowerPoint, so you can go ahead and just email it
sure.
to the participants, or use it as a resource for the Autism Society.
Yes, and I'll email the link to the recording, which I'll have up tomorrow on our website. So feel free to share it with others who are also in the same boat, and we'll get through this together. So thanks.
Great. So watch your emails. Your districts are probably going to be sending out emails to families or posting on their websites when some of those things are, when some decisions are made. So watch your district's websites and emails for some of that information this summer.
Perfect. All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Here, and thanks again.
Take care. Have a great night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.